Coming up, Indigenous health, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and who's ready for some football? I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from Indian country today.
Arizona is home to 22 tribal nations and more than 340,000 Native Americans. Arizona State University builds on more than 6 decades of working and partnering with tribal nations and communities. Many of our Native faculty incorporate Indigenous knowledge systems in seeking solutions through a process of community engagement that respects and honors traditional ways of thinking. Together, we are creating community solutions leading to a more equitable future.
This is Indian Country Today.
Ku'watsi Hopa. Thank you for joining us. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. The president of the National Congress of American Indians, Fawn Sharp, is receiving diplomatic recognition from the United States. On Wednesday, the U.S. Department of State announced her delegate position for the United Nations Climate Conference. Sharp becomes the first tribal leader elected exclusively by tribal citizens to receive this recognition. Before she left for Scotland, Sharp spoke about her determination to have Indigenous voices at the table during this summit.
I've been to many international climate negotiations, but it's always been under the badge of someone else. It's been under the badge of an NGO, but we are hoping we can participate, be at the table on the inside this year, not as a spectator on the outside with all the other observers. And so our mission is to have a seat at the table.
The NCAI president will be in attendance at COP26 through its end on November 12th. Well, prepare your alarm clocks. This weekend, Americans will fall back as the country switches to daylight savings time. On Sunday at 2 a.m., our clocks will switch back an hour in an effort to save some daylight. According to a psychiatrist writing for Psychology Today, even this 1 hour of disruption to our body's natural rhythm can trigger danger. Some people may suffer from workplace injuries, have accidents, or even heart attacks. Medical experts say to be aware as your body adjusts to the time change. And that warning could be particularly important for Hopi and Navajo people living in Tuba City in northern Arizona. The town has 2 time zones because it's both on the Navajo Nation and in the state of Arizona. Arizona does not observe daylight saving time, so the 2 Hopi villages near Tuba City, Upper and Lower Moncopee, are on Mountain Standard Time, while Tuba, which is on the Navajo reservation, will fall back with the time zone change. If that's confusing, consider this. People living in Tuba City, Arizona can walk across the street and can either lose an hour or gain an hour depending on which way they walk. A fight to preserve the Samoan language in San Francisco. The Leola Havard Early Education School has opened what's believed to be the first immersion language school in the U.S. mainland. At the school, the young students learn the phrase talofa, which means hello. It's all in an effort to protect the language. Around 60,000 Samoans live in California, which is the largest population outside of the island nation. School officials said this move was important because the growing population of Samoan children may lose their native language if they aren't exposed to it.
So instilling language and culture is a huge part of a student's identity, and especially if you come from minority communities or more vulnerable or marginalized communities, having teachers that look like you, sound like you, right? Instill that in you is also going to help you with your confidence in learning.
The school also teaches cultural lessons like singing and dancing.
We're here, so I feel like we're being seen and we're being heard, and no one's forgetting about us in this mainland, in the education system as well.
Currently, a group of around 20 children ages 4 and 5 are enrolled in the program. The Canadian band Indian City is making music for beyond the pandemic with its new album, Code Red. This is the 4th album from the Winnipeg collective, which plays pop folk music. Indian City says their new work conveys hope and the need for inclusion, understanding, and optimism. The album features acclaimed singers and musicians like Cree Métis citizens Don Amero and Sandra Sutter. And the music collective is led by award-winning Ojibwe citizen Vince Fontaine. He says the album was inspired in part by his nation's thinking of 7 generations ahead.
We do have that I guess, a gift from the Creator that we can look ahead, and we want to look ahead, and we want to give our support and input to our fellow, people of Mother Earth, right?
The album is now available digitally on several streaming platforms. And those are the headlines for Indian Country today. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. When we come back, the University of North Dakota opens a Department of Indigenous Health, and the Indian Child Welfare Act is back in court. Stay with us. Dr. Don Warren's mission is to train more Indigenous people in medicine and health fields. He's the Associate Dean at the School of Medicine and Health Sciences at the University of North Dakota. Patty Thalahongva spoke with him about his programs.
Indians into Medicine, or InMed, has been around since 1973, so we're getting close to our 50-year anniversary, and we're very pleased that we've had over 260 American Indian and Alaska Native medical school graduates out of InMed programming. So really feel like we're doing our part trying to increase the numbers of American Indian physicians. And if you look at the most recent census data, there's about 9.7 million American Indian and Alaska Native people. And unfortunately, we're only about 0.4% of physicians, even though we're over 2% of the US population. So very underserved in terms of the medical community. And we know that people tend to work with communities where they are from. So we need more of us to go into medicine and related health fields.
Indigenous communities all over the world share some of the same issues.
That's why it's so important to have more of our own people going into health sciences, whether it's clinical care or research or any other field, quite honestly. I think that lived experience is so valuable in the healthcare setting, but also in the educational setting, in the business setting, and recognizing that shared history and the impact of colonization on Indigenous peoples that has common outcomes across populations. So we see similar health disparities and similar social challenges when we're looking at Indigenous people in the US, Canada, Australia, the Pacific Islands, pretty much anywhere. So the impact of colonization and subsequent historical trauma has an intergenerational impact. So one of the projects that we recently got funded through the National Institutes of Health to establish the Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center. So we're looking at the negative impact of trauma, but I think even more importantly, looking at the strengths-based and positive impact of resilience and cultural connectedness. So it's not just about documenting the disparity. We need to develop new programs that are going to improve outcomes. And I really believe that's rooted in our cultural connectedness.
Tell us about the new PhD program in Indigenous health.
One of the things that we recognize is that in the research community, first of all, there's not enough American Indians in health research, and we don't seem to be asking the right questions, generally speaking, because we don't have enough people with lived experience in tribal communities conducting the research. So in my experience, when we have people who really come from the community and really understand some of the challenges that we face, we can conduct better research, we can develop better hypotheses, and we can do a better job at identifying solutions. So that's really the purpose of the PhD. So it's the first of its kind in the world. It's a PhD in Indigenous health. And I'm so pleased we've hired 8 Indigenous health scholars to join us on our team. And among the 8 of us, we have nearly 200 years of experience.
That was Dr. Don Warren from the University of North Dakota Medical School. An Indigenous MMA fighter in Phoenix, Arizona entered the cage for the last time over the weekend. ICT's Karina Dominguez reports.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
It was a rowdy Saturday night for Indigenous MMA fighters who entered the cage at Celebrity Theater in Phoenix, with one winning his retirement fight. Shannon Rich stepped into the cage for his last time and won his pro headliner matchup against Samson Guerrero via submission in the first round, with a rear naked choke.
As soon as he kind of turned, what were you thinking?
I was like, I got him.
Rough Puff and Rumble attendees witnessed 2 knockouts, 1 technical knockout, and 7 fights that went the distance. Rich had a couple of scares that made him believe his retirement fight might not take place last weekend. First, his initial opponent, Aaron Brink, dropped out of the fight days before it was set to take place. Then his new opponent, Guerrero, struggled to turn in the proper medical documents in a timely manner. At the weigh-in at Golden Margarita on Friday, Rich was getting nervous.
If he gets them turned in, we have a 50-50 chance that we're going to fight. So.
Fortunately for Rich, it was the happy ending he was hoping for. He had a huge turnout from his hometown, Coolidge, Arizona.
I'm 51 years old, making my last fight in front of my hometown, and for a native promotion, this is a dream come true.
Rich had his first fight in 1991 when it was still called No Holds Barred.
I would go across the border to Nogales, we'd fight, and Plaza de Toros, and they would have the chicken fights, the dog fights, then the people would fight.
He was the first Native American world champion MMA fighter.
I fought in New Mexico, and it was for a native promotion, and they had the first Native American championships for mixed martial arts. And I won, and I went through the tournament and won 3 fights in a row in one night, and I got the belt.
Now that he's tapping out after 237 professional fights, the most out of any MMA fighter, he'll be exploring acting full-time.
I got my SAG card, so now I'm an actor, stuntman.
He has a movie coming out with Mickey Rourke and Michael J. White in January called The Commando, and another coming out with Bruce Willis.
Just because you're from a small town doesn't mean you are small town. You can do anything you want to do. Dream big, because dreams come true.
On Saturday, Darren Martinez from Gila River won his amateur title 265-pound matchup against George Soapy, who's Samoa from Oahu.
I've talked about this, coming and fighting, under a big card and just pursuing it.
Martinez won the Indigenous title fight, taking home a bout with the Man in the Maze engraved on it, and is looking forward to sharing his next steps.
I'm excited for everyone to know, and I'm excited to reach a new level.
And all the red boys and the red girls of Gila River, this is for you. I just want to be a positive role model and keep doing this to keep me the light.
Rough Nation is a mixed martial arts league in Arizona, and owners Joao Lopez, Adrian Romo, and Anthony Lasso are from the Tohono O'odham Nation and take great pride in their culture.
But most of all, the values of being O'odham, we carry them into our business as far as respecting everything and everybody. Our hymdog is called Our Ways. Some of that is spilled into our company too. Building relationships of, again, respect. And it's tough to do that in this business,
Rough Puff and Rumble was a first of its kind event, merging a cannabis expo with MMA pay-per-view fights. Lopez encourages therapeutic-driven approaches to healthcare because his grandmother was a sobadora and used it as a medicine, soaking it in alcohol and applying it topically to clients she would massage.
Rough Nation has grown and is growing, and it's multiplying with audience, with fans, with fighters. We can't keep up with fighters no more.
After the fights, many celebrated at the Golden Margarita, including UFC fighter Nate Diaz, who showed support for Rich and the other Rough Nation fighters. Rough Nation is offering access to the Rough, Puff, and Rumble replay. In Phoenix, Karina Dominguez, reporting for ICT.
The Indian Child Welfare Act is back in court. Cherokee citizen and host Rebecca Nagel takes a deep dive into this issue in her podcast, This Land. This underreported legal battle has far-reaching implications for tribal sovereignty. ICT's editor, Mark Trahant, talked to her this week.
We took a deep dive, like you said, into a federal lawsuit that is now waiting on the steps of the Supreme Court. And this lawsuit not only threatens the constitutionality of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is an important law for Native communities and Native families, but it actually threatens the heart of tribal sovereignty. It's making some unique legal arguments that if the Supreme Court agreed with and upheld, it could threaten the entire structure of law defending the rights of tribes. So the stakes are really, really, really high. The case is called Brackeen v. Holland, and it started in 2017 when a white couple living in the suburbs of Fort Worth wanted to adopt a Native child. That child's tribe, Navajo Nation, had identified a Navajo home, and according to the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, that's where the child should have gone. But the Brackeens sued, and they not only fought for custody of that child in family court, and they won in family court, and they had the help of the Attorney General of their state and this really powerful corporate law firm that represents people like Walmart and Amazon. But even winning custody of that child, they started a federal lawsuit to try and strike ICWA down. And that lawsuit is now waiting on the steps of the Supreme Court.
Lay out the basis for the lawsuit for us.
The federal lawsuit is pretty big and it's sprawling, and it involves 3 non-Native foster families that wanted to adopt 4 Native kids. So it's a lot to keep track of. But some important points is that every Native child in this case had a blood relative who wanted to adopt them. And each of those Native blood relatives, whether it was a cousin, whether it was grandma, got turned away by a social worker, by a family court judge, had to fight off a really aggressive white family. And 3 of those 4 Native children are now being raised in those non-Native homes. And so for the most part, the system shut out Native families from raising their own relatives and gave preferences to non-Native families. And so that bias in the system, the reason the Indian Child Welfare Act was created, you can see how it plays out in that case. And that was actually something that was really surprising for me as a reporter. I didn't expect that to be the case when I started investigating what actually happened in the custody cases. And it's heartbreaking. You know, there was one Ojibwe grandma she's the one Native relative who did win custody of her grandkid, and it took her 6 years. She had to spend 3 years fighting the child welfare system, and then another 3 years in court fighting the white foster family that wanted to adopt her grandkid. And so that story that the media loves to tell about how ICWA rips Native kids away from non-Native homes, just as a matter of fact, that's not what happened here. And so I think that that's one thing that has been unfortunately, really misreported about these cases.
That was podcast host Rebecca Nagel. This Land is in its 2nd season and is available anywhere you get your podcasts. Are you ready for some football? ICT's Caitlin Onoa Boycell took a deep dive into the Indigenous roots of American football. Let's take a look.
At the turn of the 20th century, the leading football team came from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was the first boarding school run by the U.S. government. Assimilating into a white Christian culture was the goal, and young Native children were forced to leave their families to attend this boarding school. They were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their religions.
When they arrived at Carlisle, their heads were shaved, their clothes were burned in front of them, and they were put in front of a blackboard with names written in chalk on the blackboards. And they couldn't read the names, but they were instructed to point to a name, and then that was their name.
The conditions were crude. They were fed a poor diet, and the dorms were overcrowded, making it easy for disease to spread quickly, killing young children. Thorpe came to Carlisle when he was 16 years old. Still, it was at this school and under these horrific conditions that a powerhouse football team was born. And by 1907, they were considered one of the most dynamic football teams. The players came from several different tribes. Frank Mount Pleasant is recognized with inventing the spiral pass. He was from the Tuscarora Nation. The team also pioneered the overhand spiral and other trick plays that frustrated their opponents, as documented by the school and in media reports. Elmer Bush was from the Pomo tribe, and he was inducted into the American Indian Hall of Fame in 1973. They both played with Thorpe at Carlisle. Jim Thorpe is considered one of the greatest athletes of all time. He inspired future Indigenous football players like my grandfather, Glenn Condren.
Jim Thorpe was a Native American, was a superhero. I mean, and he was a super athlete. And he played, I guess, every sport there was, and he did well at every one of them. So
Thorpe was an outstanding runner. He earned a spot on the U.S. track team and went to the 1912 Olympics. There he easily won both the pentathlon and decathlon. Later, he was accused of playing for money because he joined the New York Giants baseball club. His gold medals were taken away by the Olympic Committee and later returned. Today, he is listed as a co-champion. But some say that isn't enough.
It means so much to Indian country to restore these honors. So the letter was sent to the president of the IOC saying, we'd like to work this out, work with you. We've started the petition. We are very interested in getting this done. And we actually never heard back from him. He had one of his librarians send us a letter, and which had some actual factual information that was incorrect. So,
still, to this day, his family fights for his recognition in the Olympics. After high school, Thorpe joined the first Indigenous national football team called the Oorang Indians. The team was based in LaRue, Ohio. Walter Lingo started the team in 1922, and at that time, the NFL franchise fee was just $100 a year. The team wasn't the best. They only won 3 games in 2 years of playing. Lingo focused a lot of his team's efforts on halftime shows to entertain the crowd and advertise for his business. He owned a dog kennel and trained the dogs to perform tricks with the players. Still, Thorpe was a part of many firsts in football, including becoming the first president of the American Professional Football Association, known today as the NFL. None of this history is taught in America's public schools, not the history of government running boarding schools, and not the history of how the football players influenced the game.
And you kind of see the erasure of American history in Native Americans, not just in football. You can't say we should try to see it in all of American history. So I'm glad, we're kind of retelling this.
Because of his influence on the game, Thorpe was inducted into the Professional Football Hall of Fame, inspiring other NFL players like Jim Warren. Warren had an outstanding college career at Arizona State University. In 1987, he was on the team that won the Rose Bowl. He went on to play for the Cincinnati Bengals and the Detroit Lions and Tampa Bay, inspired by the legacy of Jim Thorpe.
It was still influential to me to see a Native person as the greatest athlete in the world.
After Warren retired from the NFL, he went into the film industry and used his voice to raise the issue of misrepresentation of natives in football. A film he produced about the use of native mascots premiered on the Fox network on Thanksgiving in 2020.
I never did play for a team with a Native mascot, but I played against teams with Native mascots. So obviously I was a target of people that wanted to say things like scalp the Indian or cut your hair.
And then, of course, when George Preston Marshall took over the football team in Washington, dropping the name on there that became so offensive that we recently saw changed because of economic pressure, not so much because of a battle of conscience. It's really opened up some eyes to help people try to rediscover the Native American impact on football, on this country.
Other notable players include Sam Bradford, who is from the Cherokee Nation and a Heisman Trophy winner. Also wide receiver that plays for the LA Chargers, Keenan Allen, who is Lumbee. And starting quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys, Dak Prescott, who is Choctaw and Apache. And more than 60 Pacific Islanders have been a part of the NFL, according to the Pacific Islanders Football Hall of Fame. And they all have this one thing in common.
You're only as good as your last play. I mean, and you never know when your last play is either.
Behind the scenes, there's one man who's looking to groom the next generation of Indigenous professional players. For 13 years, Robert Judkins has led the live production of NFL games. His job is to make sure viewers can watch their favorite team with no interruptions. He saw a need for training and held his first football camp in Southern California on the land of the Soboba Band of Luiseño Indians. 100 kids turned out, as well as some professional football players.
There are a lot of Native kids, especially in the high school ranks, that don't get exposure. Some great talent that's out there. I mean, definitely D1 prospects that are out there. And so I think there's a need for exposure and to get kids at a younger age exposed to the game of football and just exposed to sports in general.
From future D1 prospects to being considered one of the greatest athletes of all time, Indigenous people have led the effort in football. But will there ever be another Jim Thorpe?
I'm trying to think of athletes who try to do more than one sport, and I just don't think our society is structured in that capacity. I think if someone shows a great deal of skill, it's not to say it can't happen, but I think it's very unlikely.
It's been more than 109 years since Jim Thorpe and his teammates came up with trick plays that you still see today. So the next time you watch football, think about the Carlisle Indians and Jim Thorpe and how they shaped the game. Kaylin Onoa Boycell, Indian Country Today.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For more news and updates, go to IndianCountryToday.com. Have a great weekend. I'm Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing
This is Indian Country Today.